Hi again then guys, and welcome back to another look at the world of Project Gotham 4. It's actually been a little while since we looked at a vehicle from this game, so what better way to jump back in than with a Mercedes exotic, for instance. But the funny thing about this particular car, and I don't know if you guys would maybe feel a similar way, the CLK-DTM, which of course this vehicle is a very strange exotic for me because I find it very easy to forget about the car. Because it's great in every way. It's a really cool car, and there were a couple of years where you would see it in a number of different games, not just Project Gotham, but it's in Test Drive Unlimited as well, and it's a very good car in that game also, and yet you don't really see it anymore. It's not in Forza, it's not in Gran Turismo, it's not really in any games currently as far as I'm aware, and it's in this funny state of almost supercar limbo, wherein it ticks all of the boxes. It's expensive, it's exclusive, it's certainly very fast, it stands out, it looks the part, etc. And yet when you ask most petrol heads to list the most exotic Mercedes models, what would they say? Well, typically they'll say stuff like CLK-GTR, SLR, SLS, maybe the AMG GTS or the GTR. Many people just completely gloss over the CLK-DTM, and that's a very strange thing because technically it's one of the most exotic cars they've ever built. And in a funny kind of way, it actually harkens back to the homologation era of the 90s, with stuff like the 190e Evo 2 from Mercedes, or the BMW E30 M3, and even from the rally world with stuff like the Sierra RS500, which was technically more of a touring car, I know, but the Escort RS as well, the Delta Evo 2 from Lancia. There are so many of these homologation machines in the 90s, and of course from Le Mans as well, and we've even got some of those in the game, like the Pajamas and the Toyota TS20 road car. And yet this one, it comes from an era where that wasn't a requirement, as far as I'm aware. It wasn't, for instance, specified that each manufacturer, like Opel, Audi, Mercedes, had to produce a certain amount of road-going versions, as far as I'm aware, because if you think about it, Audi doesn't have a car like this. They certainly did a DTM tribute with the A4 2-litre turbo version, but it's hardly on the same level as this car. It is rare, and it's a sought-after vehicle in its own way, but it's nothing like this, certainly not an exotic like this one is. So it's an interesting car where Mercedes seemed to choose to produce it, but it wasn't a requirement. Now, in terms of performance, it's a great car. In fact, it's easily on par with most of the Black Edition vehicles, and in fact it's better than a lot of them. It can even give the SLR McLaren a great run for its money when it comes to acceleration, because you're looking at about 3.8 seconds to 60 and a top speed of up around, I believe, 198 miles an hour. This is a very fast car, especially when it has nowhere near the power of something like a CLK GTR or an SLR McLaren or like a 722 edition or anything like that. So why does this car get forgotten so much? I don't really know, because it's actually a very good car. Now, in the world of Project Gotham, there are so many different levels of exotic that even something as good as this is nowhere near the top category. And that says a lot about how good those cars are, because this is a Category D vehicle, which sounds insane. A 200-mile-an-hour Mercedes, touring car for the road, in effect, and it's still 4 categories down from the top. But it just highlights, as I said, just how rabidly quick those top-level machines are, because of course stuff like Caparos and Toyota TS20s and Panos models, of course they should be way higher, but it just sounds kind of funny when you say that this is a Category D car. Now, with that in mind, how does it perform? Well, the handling is pretty well weighted, and not too surprisingly from a front-engine rear-wheel drive Mercedes, it's fairly tail-happy. You can spin up the wheels pretty easily, it's a very good drift car, and even as far as the specs that they give it, for instance, a 7 for acceleration, also a 7 for top speed. They only give it a 4 for braking though, which is pretty harsh. I mean, if anything, this car should be one of the best braking vehicles in the game. It's essentially a race car for the road to some degree. As far as grip, they give it a 6, and then a 5 for drifting. I don't necessarily agree with that. It's actually pretty drift ready, and although, of course, it's not as challenging as something like a Cobra or a Stratos, you can definitely get the tail out very easily on this car and hold some pretty nice drifts. So the question remains, why is this car so forgotten? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, actually, because I honestly do not know. It's a car which for all intents and purposes should be very, very well known. It should be talked about much more than it is. I wouldn't go so far as to saying it's like an unsung hero or anything like that, but at the same time, it definitely doesn't get the chatter that you would expect a car like this to get. To the point where, in fact, there is a version which many people don't seem to even talk about at all compared to this one, which is the open top. There's a CLK-DTM Roadster, and I actually like that one even more because, for one thing, very curiously, they chose to make the Roadster a 4-seater, and yet the coupe is a 2-seater with a sway bar in the back where the seats used to be, like a Mini Cooper John Cooper Works Edition GP. That's an interesting choice, to have 2 seats for the coupe, 4 seats for the convertible, and the convertible is significantly more expensive as well. Now, the last time I saw one for sale was probably a decade ago, and it was £230,000 for the convertible, and you're looking at about 40 or 50 grand less for the hardtop. These days, I have no doubt they're even more, but at the same time, it just goes to show that the market respects the car a lot, but for some reason most petrolheads just don't talk about this vehicle that much. And again, that really surprises me because this is easily on par with stuff like the TVR Sagaris and various other, really hardcore mid-level track day exotics where they're not necessarily breaking 200 miles an hour, but they're really close to it in some cases, and they're this far more rabid, raw approach to performance, like the Sagaris that I mentioned, like the Marcos TSO GT2, and although this Mercedes would probably beat many of those around the track because of that racing DNA, it's still a great rival for them, a very similar kind of vehicle. So overall, my thoughts as far as this car goes in the game is that the specs are definitely a little bit off as far as what they give it, but it's a good performer, the top speed is good, deceptively good in fact, the acceleration is pretty strong, and it's a good all-rounder. It's not necessarily going to blow your mind when you drive it, because again, there are so many far faster vehicles in this game that this one doesn't feel earth-shatteringly quick. But it's a very good car, and if you're the kind of person who, like me, prefers to maybe use and appreciate the more undervalued options, then it doesn't get much more undervalued than the CLK-DTM. It's a very, very underappreciated Mercedes, and I continue to be baffled by why, because it's such a cool car. So overall, that's it for my thoughts on this vehicle. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, especially if you used to play Project Gotham 4 and maybe you like to use this car or never really tried it out. But until then, I'll see you next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.